Hello, good evening. My name's Sarah Foote. I'm the Dean of Christ Church, and it's my enormous pleasure to welcome all of you to this 500th anniversary lecture hosted by Christ Church here in Manchester. I'm so pleased to see so many friends of Christ Church here, some of whom have travelled some surprising distances to come. I'm also delighted to be back in Manchester where I spent my childhood. It's lovely to be back, but I do have to admit that I've spent the entirety of the afternoon saying, this wasn't like that then. And I now realise that then was quite a lot more than 40 years ago, so probably it's not quite so surprising. Just so that you know, this event is now being live streamed and recorded and will later be available on the Christ Church YouTube channel. Those of you who are former members or know about Christ Church will know that Christ Church is singular in its structure. It's not just a constituent college of the University of Oxford, nor is it only the cathedral and mother church of the Diocese of Oxford. Christ Church is a joint foundation of both a college and a cathedral, and dedicated to religion and learning. This dual identity has shaped the foundation across the past 5 centuries, enriching scholarship and religious life in unparalleled but profoundly intertwined ways. Recently, Christ Church has embarked on a governance review, which is a necessary process to bring our structures into line with the needs of a modern institution. And just for the avoidance of doubt or misunderstanding, we are not splitting the foundation. We are splitting my person. The person of the dean after me will be 2 persons, one of whom will be in charge of the entire foundation, college, cathedral and school together, and will probably take the name Provost. And there will be a dean in the cathedral who will be like but slightly and significantly different from other cathedral deans. But we are not splitting this joint foundation. But even as we look forward and adapt, this one thing will remain constant: the fact that the cathedral is at the heart of life in Christ Church. It's a living place of worship that daily shapes all of us who live and work there and reminds us of the spiritual foundations on which our life together rests. Even as our governance evolves, we're still engaging with the enduring questions that arise at every point where faith and learning meet. And this year, particularly, we're reflecting on the vision of our founders, Cardinal Wolsey in 1525, and then King Henry VIII, a vision that shaped Christ Church across the centuries. No one is better to deliver this lecture than the Reverend and Right Honourable the Lord Williams, formerly Archbishop of Canterbury, whose ties to Christ Church run very deep. He spent his first year of doctoral studies at Christ Church before he was appointed to a senior scholarship at Wadham College, where he finished his doctorate. When he came back to Oxford, he did so as Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity, during which time he was a canon in the cathedral. Rowan is now an honorary student, which in any other college would be called an honorary fellow of the college. And as you all know, he's an active theologian, writer, and poet. He brings wisdom drawn both from his academic inquiry and his own pastoral and sacramental ministry. After his address, we will hear reflections from Professor Andrew Davison, who's the current Regius Professor of Divinity, a residentiary canon in the cathedral, and Professor Michael Simmons Roberts, a leading poet and thinker, and we'll be asking both of them to bring their perspectives to Rowan's insights. Tonight, I hope we can reflect on how we learn, how we find meaning, and how, even in an institution which is changing rapidly, the enduring presence of the Cathedral Church at Christ Church remains a living wellspring of purpose. So it's my huge pleasure to welcome the Right Reverend Dr. Rowan Williams to talk to us on Humanist learning, a vision for today. Rowan.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you for the opportunity of opening this evening's discussion. because I do believe that what I want to do is to open a discussion rather than to seal a conclusion, which is why the presence of Michael and Andrew alongside is so crucial to this evening's event. I'm by no means a professional Renaissance historian, but I hope that those who know more about this will bear with me if I start with a little bit of Renaissance history. Christchurch, in its original foundation, was part of a humanist program. Humanist in the sense that that word had, in the 15th and early 16th century, designating a new learning, a new understanding not only of what the academic task was, but of what the whole educational process assumed and required. Central to this project was the recovery of ancient languages, which to us sounds a very strange way of entering upon a program of academic or intellectual renewal. But I hope it'll be clear as I unpick that a little, just why the recovery of the ancient languages mattered in the way that it did. We're sometimes a little prone to think of the great conflicts of the early 16th century, not least the Reformation conflict, in terms of a renewed, forward-looking spirit associated with reformers and a static, backward-looking and unadventurous intellectual identity reserved for Catholics. The uncomfortable truth about humanism, though, is that humanism in that era crossed confessional boundaries. The word humanist covers an extraordinarily wide range of writers and thinkers. John Calvin, Pico della Mirandola, Machiavelli, Erasmus, Cardinal Poole. What do those have in common? Not a lot, except that they could all be designated humanists. They were all committed in their very diverse ways to rethinking the intellectual world and its boundaries in conversation with a newly revived, a newly highlighted awareness of the classics of Greek and Latin literature. But within that, at least three motivations come into focus. First of all, humanism in this period is indeed a challenge to certain kinds of static and backward-looking educational practice, and consequently, something of a challenge to particular varieties of unchallengeable clerical power. To that extent, there is some truth in the textbook simplification that humanism is a reforming, and in some contexts, an anti-clerical movement. It pushes back against the scholastic inheritance of the Middle Ages, in which linear argument, the clarification of concepts, and the reinforcement of a coherent body of doctrine added up to what essentially education was about. So, yes, there is an element of protest in this. But secondly, lest we should take for granted the modern assimilation of humanist to secularist, part of the motivation of humanism was to draw people into a deeper, less external or mechanical form of religious exploration. Humanism is allied not only to the study of ancient literature, but very often to the recovery of ancient hermetic, mystical texts, the recovery of a sense of the sacred, not entirely confined by the sacramental theology of the 15th century. Thirdly, humanism, by turning back to the classics of Greek and Latin literature, humanism revives an interest in, quite simply, style. Not style for its own sake, but style as in the fullest sense, rhetoric. The art of saying things well. Not something that's absent, of course, from medieval educational practice, far from it. But in humanism, the concern with how you wrote and how you spoke became more and more pressing, more and more immediate. An educated person now was somebody who knew how to speak persuasively, with, I think, an even more powerful process of formation with that in view than had applied in the Middle Ages. Any of you who are familiar, and it may not be absolutely all of you, with the kind of Latin written in the Middle Ages, will realize that style is not a primary consideration for a lot of people writing theology and many other things as well. But suddenly, in humanist education, doing it well, making it sound good, became increasingly important. So, not a simple phenomenon, not a one-dimensional protest movement, not just antiquarianism, but an attempt to rethink the intellectual life, to rethink it very much in the context of public discourse, public debate, the kind of thing that the great classical masters, and they are mostly masters, the great classical masters were focused on. Say it well, say it persuasively, and say it in the context of the processes of governance. The job of the educated person is to contribute to governance. That is, to be a good counselor. And to be a good counselor, you need to know how to persuade. So, I've begun by a warning about generalizing or indeed idealizing humanism. Once again, a caution about some of the textbook versions. Here's one version of European history. In the Middle Ages, nobody had any original thoughts. In the Middle Ages, original thought was penalized. Scientific inquiry was discouraged, and the entire intellectual life of Western Europe was dominated by dogmatic considerations in the interests of the hierarchical church. Humanism arrives and liberates free intellectual inquiry and sets us on the irreversible road towards the Enlightenment, where, as we all know, universal rationality and scientific clarity prevailed for good and all, and history came to an end. Well, as a younger generation like to say, that worked, didn't it? But in fact, the picture is a great deal more complex than that. Humanism had almost nothing to do with scientific inquiry, and not a great deal to do with intellectual liberty as we understand it these days. It was a highly elite and restricted practice. Its interest in the technical management of the world was extremely limited, compared with the extraordinary outbursts of technological creativity that we see between the 12th and the 15th century in the much maligned Middle Ages. Its concern was not with a kind of ideal of the autonomous human subject, an Enlightenment variety, and its politics could be quite murky, depending, as it did very strongly, on the patronage of the wealthy and powerful. So beware of idealizing, beware of anachronism. But here's the significant qualification. Its core concern with these issues of intelligent persuasion, conversation, the discourse of intelligent governance, areas where plain logical demonstration doesn't always do what you'd like it to do. This means that humanism is, indeed, very much a political enterprise, though not quite in the sense we might give to that word these days. It's about how social cohesiveness, durability, intelligibility are created and maintained. and style and rhetoric, sense of how to use a rich and resourceful vocabulary in creating and reinforcing common culture, and very often creating and reinforcing also forms of governance and control. That's about signalling the register of non-violent consensus. How do we sustain a social conversation? Not in the modern sense of democratic participation, but in the sense I hinted earlier, a practice, a habit of what in Latin you'd call consulere. Not simply consultation, but shared deliberation. Governance as practiced around the council table of a ruler. Non-violent hegemony, you might say. This means that when we describe some 16th century figure as a humanist, we're saying something about their social position, about their political task, about the register in which you would expect them to write, not very much about their doctrinal commitments in a narrower sense. As I said, any noun which can be applied to John Calvin, Machiavelli, and Cardinal Poole has to have a rather restricted core meaning. These were people who disagreed quite spectacularly about doctrinal issues and even about ethical issues, but would be united in some sense in the practice of humanistic discourse as counsel. You could say, then, that the humanist is someone who is equipped for handling intellectual power, or maybe better, someone equipped for handling power intellectually. Handling power intellectually. That is, appealing not simply to a theological foundation for how power is exercised, but interrogating and exploring how the exercise of power could become a topic of reasoned, pragmatic, classically informed inquiry. Once again, the health warning has to be put in. Humanists, partly because they were very often the clients of powerful patrons, could be, and frequently were, the servants of absolutist government. They were not liberals. They were committed to, very often, a rather unquestioning loyalty to forms of governance that most moderns, outside a few notorious contexts, would regard as regressive. And yet, the very notion that the exercise of power could be a topic for intellectual reflection carries within itself, in the long duration, seeds of a challenge to absolutism. Seeds which take a while to grow up, to germinate and to flourish, and yet which, in the 18th and 19th centuries, become, in ways which Calvin, Machiavelli, and Cardinal Poole would doubtless have deplored, become a stimulus to another vision of political life. But if that's what the humanist is in a social and political context, then the great educational question of the 16th century is something like, what does education look like if it's conceived as education about power, about persuasion, and about the containment of merely arbitrary rule? A humanist might be the apologist for an absolutist monarch, but wouldn't necessarily be the apologist for an arbitrary system of governance. So the humanist isn't necessarily by any means a democrat, but one who sets in motion questions of legitimacy and good order, intelligibility in relation to how public conversation is to be pursued and how communities are to be governed. Perhaps it's a bit startling for us to see this kind of question as defining the educational process. What does education look like if it's conceived as education about power? A startling thing, and maybe an unwelcome or unattractive thing, because that question has so steadily been corrupted over the centuries into the mere training of a governing class. Training not so much in the arts of persuasion as in the arts of narrowly literary skill. The great and idiosyncratic former master of Magdalen College, Cambridge, Arthur Benson, whose journals have been published this last summer and provide, I have to say, extremely entertaining holiday reading. Arthur Benson had spent many years in his earlier career as a master at Eton, and wrote extensively and controversially about the way in which the English governing class was shaped simply by learning how to write Greek and Latin verse. He raised the not unreasonable question of whether this was in fact an adequate preparation for the stresses of public life. It probably prevented him becoming headmaster of Eton when that job fell vacant. I'm happy to say that Magdalen College, Cambridge, provided a much more congenial home for him and an outlet for some of his more imaginative projects. But that corruption of humanist formation into a mere set of literary skills, which in turn become tribal markers of a governing elite, that tends to make us rather suspicious of what I've suggested as the original humanist impulse. If humanist learning is simply acquiring the gloss of familiarity with a set of remote texts and a fluency in dead languages, quite divorced from the role of persuasion and governance, you may well think it's a rather inadequate option. But if we do find that version of this kind of learning unattractive, it may be that we haven't yet looked hard enough at the original rationale, which I've tried to summarize in what I've said so far. And this is where I turn, in the next part of what I want to say, to some of the questions that all of that might put on the table for us as we think forward about what a humanist education might entail in the 21st century. It can hardly be denied that we're now in the middle of a process in which humanistic learning, in the widest sense imaginable, is deeply under threat. I don't mean by this simply that humanities subjects in higher education are the Cinderella at the ball, but there are two kinds of pressure which seem at present to push against any ideal of humanist formation in the older style. On the one hand, but I'll come back to this in more detail in a moment, there is the immensely expanded scientific world. A world of a discourse around understanding, imagination, control, manipulation, experiment, discovery. A world not envisaged by humanist learning, or indeed for the most part by scholastic learning in the Middle Ages, and yet now regarded as the canonical way to think, or rather to think hard, as opposed to thinking soft. I've just finished reading an advanced copy of Steven Pinker's new book on what everybody knows we know. And Pinker, committed and articulate rationalist of a particular kind, complains in his penultimate chapter of the corruption that is inflicted on our corporate intellectual life by all sorts of academic disciplines that do not have any hard edges of certainty. The relativism of the modern humanities, he says, is responsible for a great deal of the intellectual and moral decay of the modern world. We need more precision, we need more exactitude, we need more people like Steven Pinker. It's an entertaining, lively, very lucid book, which I've much enjoyed, but it does illustrate some of the caricatures of what humanistic learning might be. Is humanistic learning simply a slightly amended and slightly democratized version of Etonian Greek and Latin 120 years ago? Is it just about the creation of a self-serving, self-referential practice in which the exchange of tribal symbols in the form of various kinds of technical jargon substitutes for hard thinking? You may not be surprised to know that my answer to that is no, but that, I think, is one of the pressures. The other pressure is what I will unashamedly call the corrupt pragmatism and commodification of education in terms of providing narrow skills for economic security or advance. The proposal that the success, credibility of higher education institutions be assessed by the mean income of its graduates after a period of years tells you all you need to know about this approach to education. Neither of those very different pressures sit at all easily with the notion that education might even primarily be, an education about power, a way of thinking through persuasion, cohesion, the maintenance of conversation. And so that's why perhaps the point of dusting off the humanist legacy is not some kind of opposition to a scientific worldview, not some kind of merely Luddite suspicion of technological revolutions, something slightly deeper, an invitation to people to ask more consistently, more creatively, how and why it is that some questions come to be taken as self-evident, and how taking certain issues as self-evident is one of the most effective tools of unaccountable power. Isn't it obvious is one of the most lethal phrases that can be used in the intellectual world. And whether that obviousness is in terms of pre-modern dogmatism or modern scientism, I don't say modern science, the effect is much the same. And here's the paradox, that to ask that kind of question, why are some things regarded as self-evident? What are the possibilities of power and persuasion in this context? How do we create a conversation that's not simply about winning and losing, but about managing constructively and liberating possibility? All of that is part of the classical humanist agenda. All of that ought to be extremely good news for scientific research, if it is anything other than mere technical skill and its refinement. Likewise, the supposed self-evidence of profit and utility as the goals of education cannot be left unchallenged. Once again, we can say that worked, didn't it, as we look at the long-term effects of a narrow and anti-humanist educational practice on rising generations for whom issues around mental health and the void of meaning have become more and more pressing as time has gone on. In short, the point of dusting off the legacy of humanism is to bring to light the human in humanism. What is education doing, broadly speaking, to create, sustain, and deepen an awareness of the human as something requiring intellect and imagination to be exercised at depth? How does the educational process help us to understand its own structure? Does education make us curious about what it is to be a learning being? And here I find myself coming back repeatedly to the sense that we are in an intellectual and cultural moment in which learning about our own learning is perhaps harder than it has been. We are more and more reluctant to tell the story of how we have learned to be who we are, with the result that some of our debate about, for example, our national heritage in this country becomes a chaos of warring mythologies, rather than a serious interrogating of how we came to be where we are and who we are. And that latter interrogation seems to be entirely consistent with the legacy of humanism in this wider sense. We learn that we are learning beings. We learn how we have learned. We learn, as Cardinal Newman spelled out so wonderfully in the 1870s in his Grammar of Assent, we learn the extraordinary diversity of the ways in which we learn. By experiment, by imagination, by science, by poetry, by relationship. A proper educational process, by encouraging us to learn how we learn, opens up to us the diversity, the richness of intellectual life as something quite other than granular bits of problem solving. Understanding our humanity as a learning business, as, to pick up an image that's used by Thomas Aquinas, commenting on the mystical writer Pseudo-Dionysius, a very unlikely authority in this context, what he calls the helical advance of intelligence, the spiraling of understanding, moving backwards and forwards from the particular to the general, and again, in an imaginative exploration that can't be reduced simply to problem solving. And what is in view is not so much control, let alone profit and advantage, but an intensified attention to, and as I like to say, attunement to, a world which continues to make us learn. And that includes refining and developing our skills of attending to one another. We're back here with that dimension of persuasive, rhetorical, argumentative, conversational modes of governance and discovery with which the humanists of the 16th century were familiar. The active climate of what I'd like to call real civic labor, the work that consolidates civic and civil exchange in the building of sustainable social patterns. So, moving to my last reflection. Christchurch as a humanistic foundation in the 16th century reflects the way in which humanism was both a critical and a traditional exercise. Critical in uncovering and deploying newly refined, newly rediscovered tools for thought, with an eye to developing the skills thus matured in the processes of public discourse, governance, the sustaining of some kind of intelligent social order. But alongside that, in Christchurch, part of the humanist revival was the revival of theology. the endowment of teaching positions in theology, rather like the one which I had the honour to hold for some years, the Lady Margaret Chair, the first named chair in theology in Oxford or Cambridge. That is the first foundation whose specific purpose was to do something other than just rehearse the traditional curriculum, but ask some fresh questions with some fresh resources. I was extremely proud to hold that chair for a while and to reflect on what it meant in terms of Christ Church's original vision. That alliance between humanist renewal and a revitalizing of theology in the context of a liturgical life, that was not unique in the 16th century to Christ Church. And it's fascinating, if rather poignant, to read that one of the things which Thomas Cromwell, in his slightly better moments, of which I think there were one or two, Thomas Cromwell envisaged as a possible future for some of the great English monasteries, which for a short period he thought might perhaps not be dissolved, but be turned into something rather like Christ Church. That is, centres of formation, intellectual exploration, and liturgical practice altogether. Henry VIII, that model of the humanist prince, thought otherwise. But that fusion between the intellectual, the theological, the liturgical, that does speak, whatever your particular level of religious commitment, it does speak for a sense that there is a resonance between humanism, as I've been characterizing it, and faith. Simply in the sense that a humanism so conceived understands our humanity as a radically unfinished and unfinishable thing, which is nourished and enlarged not simply by the acquisition of arm's-length knowledge, but by growth into a skill of communication and exchange. Faith sees our humanity as something quintessentially restored, re-established in communion. Humanism makes a more modest claim that the conversation of the intelligent is intrinsic, essential to our maturing, to our full intellectual capacity. But these are not enemies. These are not alternatives in some intellectual zero-sum game. Thought about together, they help us learn about the centrality of shared inquiry and mutual exchange as the path of humanization. It's not an anachronistic vision. It's not a vision which is likely to command majority assent these days, either in political or academic circles. But as long as there is a Christ Church around, to be what I'd like to call an imaginative nuisance to people who think they've got it all wrapped up, I think we have cause to be grateful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, Lord Williams has done us a great service in this anniversary year, not least with his choice of topic, holding this Christian humanist tradition before us, out of which our college cathedral was founded. You've reminded us that this remains a vital part of our history and ongoing mission. You mentioned style, and I'm tempted to dwell on the need for a certain renewal of style in academic writing today, but I will resist that temptation. Our talk covered many insights, not least about common life and public conversation. Indeed, that might be the most important part of the lecture this evening. I won't pretend to have expertise on such themes, but what I will say is that the language of Christian humanism seems to be enjoying something of a revival at the moment, and that I think is much to be welcomed. as a celebration and defense of the human, of deliberation, and of a breadth of reference in thinking and writing. I know that it's close to the heart of my colleague Luke Brotherton, the new Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology, just recently appointed. And I also recall how often Christian humanism has come up in conversations with Carmody Gray, a wonderful academic recently of Durham, now a professor at Radboud University in the Netherlands. For my part, the language of humanism, of Christian humanism, has also been part of how I have tried to describe the work of college chaplaincy, which I can report is doing very well in many places in the two universities I've taught. Each year as Dean of Chapel in Cambridge, I would quote Terence in talking about the outlook of the chapel, that I am human and nothing human is alien to me, ought to be a motto close to our heart. There's a danger perhaps in saying that of simple indiscriminate celebration, and there is after all something of a note of warning in the gospel before God's even louder affirmation. Nonetheless, I think that celebration of life, of humanity, delight in learning of all sorts is a good basis for a college chapel. The lectionary and the problems that people bring for private conversation will provide grit enough alongside that. And I can also report that this vision of humanism is doing well in online and print journals. So, to mention my colleague Luke again, he recently organised a conference, much of it in Christchurch, and there was a particularly excellent, I would say even rather moving panel that looked at the work of a US magazine, Comment, which is very much grounded in this tradition, alongside two impressive Christian charities committed to the common good and civic life, all framed right through in the language of Christian humanism. Or we might think of Plough Quarterly, the latest edition of which was launched in Christchurch Chapter House the evening before last. So this theme of humanism, of 16th century Christian humanism, is such a good one for us to have in mind in this anniversary year. And I note some hopeful signs of its fruitfulness. Nonetheless, I'd be remiss if I didn't also note that the vision of humane learning that has been presented to us so eloquently this evening is under threat. Now, of course, we should always be wary of accounts of history that put us in the unique and decisive place, but I do think there is some poignancy in recalling together this wellspring of so much that has characterized humanities learning for 5 centuries, when we hear, year by year, of departments and degrees closing in classics, philosophy, English, and modern languages. I'm pleased to say that the full range of humanities disciplines remains strong at Oxford, not least at Christchurch, remarkably strong. But I fear that Oxford will come to hold that torch in an increasingly darkened landscape. Undergraduate courses with tutorials are expensive, and I expect the Development Office will be in touch with people to think about helping to secure that into the future. My own energies, and I've been in this post for a year, and I'm reflecting on this as one of the things absolutely at the top of our agenda together. My own energies are focused more on access to graduate degrees. To borrow a phrase from Hemingway, Research Council funding for master's and doctoral programs has been withdrawn first slowly and then all at once. There is, I think, unbelievably, now less than one such scholarship per faculty in the humanities division for scores of wonderful applicants. We lose excellent candidates every year to America for that reason. That's a shame, although I'm pleased that they do get to study somewhere. I'm more worried about the brilliant graduate applicants who receive an offer but can't take it up for lack of funds. Anyway, I'll stop. I realise I'm straying unbidden onto the territory of the Development Office, but we are at a critical moment in perpetuating the 16th century legacy. And a third challenge I want to point to is the significance of languages in that 16th century wellspring. I was a scientist until I was 25, so I missed out on learning languages at school, and I've tried to do something about that since, and it's been a joy, particularly in the last few years. I thought, right, I'm going to try and learn to read French, and it's really been one of the happiest things of the last few years. And I think these are absolutely at the heart of humanities scholarship, although increasingly universities are seeing ancient and modern languages as simply too expensive. I've been thinking about that recently in terms of the way in which AI can now offer on-the-spot translation. I mean, this has really taken off in the last couple of years and is extremely proficient nowadays. But think about what's happening if I ask my phone to capture a page of text and offer a live translation. It literally strips out the English, the French or the Italian, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and puts the English in its place. In one sense, it is allowing me to read a text in another language with no friction. But at the same time, in that very act, this technology is preventing me from reading that other language. It's literally taking that text away and putting something there. It's drawing a veil over the other language. Now, I'm no Luddite when it comes to technology or artificial intelligence. What my phone can do is in one way good, but in another way bad. And I think that what it doesn't do, what it even impedes, is worth learning and celebrating. Whatever you say about education, maybe university education, it's about understanding, it's about subtlety, about joy, and about the expansion of perspective that comes from seeing things in a new way. Certainly true of all the sciences, but in the humanities, I think nothing represents those dimensions: understanding, subtlety, joy, the expansion of perspective, more than learning languages, whether that's in a modest or advanced way. Hardly anything about the 16th century legacy is more under threat than languages. Oxford, I'm sure, will hold out, whether in modern languages or in ancient languages, in theology, classics, Asian and Middle Eastern studies. But I'd really like to see us double down on the importance of language learning and promote it for students of all degrees, and even expand its place in existing degrees. And again, this needs support. It's something to fight for. As a final subject, I want to pick up on science, since it has featured this evening, and I was a scientist before I was a theologian. Lord Williams has suggested that science gains from the humanistic endeavour. And I haven't yet got to know my scientific colleagues at Christ Church as well as I did in my previous college, although I'm glad they've kind of welcomed me as one of their own. But I can report that many scientists are deeply immersed in the humanities, enriched by it personally. But I don't think that that's what Rowan was saying this evening, or more than that, that even that the humanities life is a benefit even to the scientist's science. And I think here of the late Tom McLeish, very much a scientist and humanist, who wrote about the central place of creativity in the business of being a scientist. He pointed out that philosophy of science almost always only picks up at the point where you've got a theory to test. And then it gives us very many intricate accounts of what it might mean to test a hypothesis. But Tom pointed out that there is a really important stage that goes before that, which is when you have the bright idea that gives you something to test in the first place. And he saw that as deeply creative, akin to art or music. And he saw the humane hinterland of the scientist as part of what made that scientific work fruitful. And to that, I'd add the value of what the humanities can offer when it comes to approaching scientific questions in new ways, in really radical new ways that move things on. So to use terms from Thomas Kuhn, everyday science can probably get by without a great deal of philosophical depth, but our jumps in understanding, Kuhn's paradigm shifts, require some fundamental reformulation of the way in which you lay things out, the angle from which you see things. And I think that as a provocation for reframing the question, philosophy can play a really vital role, as can the way in which theology or literature and many other disciplines help us to reframe what we mean, what we think we mean by our concepts. In Cambridge, I saw a great appetite for that, for drawing the humanities into scientific work in the new Leverhulme Centre for Life in the Universe, where humanities were right heart of that from the beginning. And I'd hardly been in Oxford at all before something of a parallel at Oxford, the Oxford Planetary Initiative, were drawing the humanities and asking me to be part of that, which I'm grateful for. I want to end by noting when it comes to this kind of interdisciplinary, really radically interdisciplinary thought that shakes things up, that there can be, I can think of, no other theologian more able to turn up to any academic discussion and throw new light upon it than Rowan Williams, nor is anybody recognized quite so much for the ability to do just that. So in a year when we are celebrating the achievements of Christchurch and its long history, we should take a moment also to recall and celebrate the contribution which this Welsh archiepiscopal polyglot alumnus of the house has made not only to learning, but to church and to state. We do not only have to turn back to the 16th century for an example, even an exemplar of such humanism. Thank you. And now I invite Michael Simmons-Roberts to address us.
Thank you very much. I must start by thanking Rowan for inviting me to take part in this event, and to thank Christchurch College and Sarah for making this happen. It's a pleasure to be sharing the platform with Rowan and Andrew tonight. The last time I was in this hall was on a wet winter's evening. I'd been writing about a piece of music, Olivier Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time, and for the previous year, I've been streaming recordings of that music on loop. I've loved it since I bought a record of it on spec as a student, but I'd never heard it performed live. When I read that the Manchester Collective was performing it here in the Stoller Hall, I felt it was time to risk it. I'd never heard it live because I felt it was mine. A private passion, me and this quartet. So I was unprepared for the physical and communal power of being part of this music in this place, with so many people intensely and fully engaged. A private passion being shared, and the music a physical presence in the room. It was, as D.H. Lawrence might have said, the difference between music in the head and music in the body and soul. In community, not a digital loop, but a unique live encounter. It seems apposite to come back here to discuss humanist learning, or more specifically, in my case, to think about poetry as part of a vision for humanist learning today. Why bring poetry to this debate? One practical answer is that Rowan is himself an eminent poet, and he invited me to speak tonight. So it's a fair assumption that he thinks poetry has something to contribute. Poetry is one of many forms of making and learning that can help to form this vision. But poetry is at the sharp end in ways that make it, in my view, particularly pertinent. Like many of the arts, it is at the same time a creative and critical field. But compared with many other art forms, I would argue that it's culturally vital, but economically irrelevant, unless you extend its scope to include its sister art, song lyrics. That, combined with the fact that it is a language art, but one that sits as close to music as it does to prose, can make the practice of writing poems and reading them both liberating and challenging. And I like the phrase that Rowan was using, the idea of humanist tradition as being the art of saying things well, which is a pretty good definition of what poetry aspires to do as well. The late Australian poet Les A. Murray, whose poetry is published by the wonderful Carcanet Press in this city, as is Rowan's poetry, tried in several of his essays to tease out what made poetry a potent way of learning about ourselves and the world around us. And he settled on the term whole speak. I'm not keen on the Orwellian phrase, I must admit, but he makes a compelling case that almost every form of language we use is a form of narrow speak. Poetry, at its best, aspires to explore and communicate truth in a form of language that is richly metaphorical, musical, intimate, and public, embodied and metaphysical, innovative and new, yet in conversation with all the poems of the past. This, he says, is whole speak, and that's what poems aspire to. What does this mean? Murray talks about poetry's three-legged stool, the waking mind, the dreaming mind, and the dance or the body. This is helpful, particularly for its reminder that poems are not just intellectual exercises. But when trying to describe what poems do, I find myself going back to one of Simone Weil's most challenging bits of prose poetry, when she describes two prisoners in adjoining cells knocking on the wall to communicate with each other. So the wall is what separates them, but it's also their only possibility of connection. Every separation is a link, she says. It is a powerful metaphor for the relationship between human beings and their creator, but it's also a pretty good description of how it feels to make a poem. The words inevitably form a wall between you and the world, but it is only through working at and through the words that a poet may get close to saying something real, true, and surprising. You do not write a poem in order to explain what you know to someone who doesn't know it. If you've got something to say, why not just say it? You write a poem when you don't know what you have to say, when the learning is yet to take place. You are exploring something beyond your linguistic ability, on the other side of the wall. All poems fall short. How could they not? That's why you write the next one. Rowan has spoken about the delusive pragmatism for which the sole purpose of education is to equip individuals for profitable economic activity. It's no secret, as has been said tonight, that many humanities subjects are struggling to recruit at university level. And there are plenty of good reasons beyond economics why the so-called STEM subjects matter to us all. But narrow definitions of what education does are damaging to all disciplines. It's clearly not the case that the sciences are the only means of learning about the world and ourselves. And it's equally clear, as Andrew was saying earlier, that the humanities do not have a monopoly on creativity. About a decade ago, when I was put together with the geneticist Sir John Solston as part of a project to develop conversations between poets and scientists, I assumed there might be more in it for the poets than for the scientists, as the poets would get poems out of it while the scientists got maybe lunch. But John quickly quashed that. As the man who led the team that mapped the human genome, he was adamant that scientists and poets deal in the same currency, metaphor. And as poems are a rich resource of metaphor making, they should be of keen interest to scientists, he said. As soon as scientific data or discovery is framed in language, it becomes metaphorical. And the scientists who make the discoveries are often the primary metaphor makers. The human genome didn't need to be a form of mapping, but once that metaphor attached to it, a host of other metaphors about landscape and ownership also attached to it and conditioned the public discourse. Among the defining objectives of humanist learning are a recognition that it takes place in dialogue with a tradition, that it deepens and enriches our understanding of the world and our shared humanity, that it aspires to truth-speaking and can speak truth to power, and that it aspires to what Rowan has called the real civic labor of collaborative world-making. In the practice of poetry, writing it, reading it, and even teaching it, the collaborative world-making comes through a vertical and horizontal dialogue with a long line of poets and poems that lead to the one you might write this evening, and the rich and varied community of poets across the world who are also writing new poems this evening. When you put a new poem out into the world, it is in conversation with all the other poems, with all that's been heard and said. It will fail, as we've said, but maybe the next one will be closer to the act of witness or truthfulness that you're after. Maybe you can push the words that bit further. Like any form of learning, there are methods that have worked for others. Pithy bits of advice to get past what Ted Hughes called the inner policeman, like the challenge to write like you're dead, or to remind yourself that your notebook is a private space and nothing reaches the reader unless you choose to make that connection. D.H. Lawrence, who though he did a fair bit of ranting in poems, also wrote some of the best we have, particularly in his Birds, Beasts and Flowers collection, advocated fast writing, often outside if you're writing about or from a particular place, bringing all your senses to bear on the time, circumstances, sights, scents, and sounds of your subject. For Lawrence, that could mean responding to the rude, vital force of a cypress tree, to doing that from a body and in a body that was dying of tuberculosis at the time. Lawrence's insistence on embodied thinking and feeling and writing was a quality he found in one of his great influences, Walt Whitman. And in his dialogue with Whitman, as well as with Shelley, Dante, the writers of the Old and New Testaments, and many other poets, is a thread in all his work. If you do write a poem tonight, you are not writing in a vacuum. You're stepping into a river of countless voices, all aspiring to whole speak. Rowan has written and spoken in the past about Simone Weil's use of the word attention, and I'm very drawn to it too. Her notion of attention is as much an ethical and potentially spiritual practice as a political one. The quality of attunement or attentiveness, of conscious openness to each other and to the world, is another key teaching from Simone Weil. It's no surprise that so many poets are fascinated by her and her work. Not only does she think and write in metaphorical structures very much like prose poems, but her understanding of attention is close to the heart of much poetic practice. In American poetry, for example, there is a line of 20th century poets like Jory Graham and Mary Oliver, Wendell Berry, Gary Snyder, and others, in which the making of poems involves a practice of attention, often described in essays and interviews as a kind of meditation, in particular when writing about what's now often called the more than human world. Many of these, along with British poets like John Burnside and Alice Oswald, have spoken about the importance of these poems born of attention, being written on the lips, to use Ossip Mandelstam's phrase, or to the rhythm of walking, like Dante, or even Seamus Heaney tapping out the tune of a poem on his steering wheel on long drives, which his wife knew was the sign that a poem was on the way. There is, of course, a risk of romanticizing or mystifying the process of making poems by setting too much store by these practices, just as there is with the resurgence of interest in learning poems by heart. The poet Derek Walcott used to make his Boston master's students learn W.H. Auden's poem The Fall of Rome by heart as their first bit of homework, based on his conviction that to hold a great poem inside your head gives you, as a poet or a reader, a much deeper, more transformative relationship with that poem than any number of close readings on the page. Lots of poems don't have The Fall of Rome or any other poem committed to memory. And even a major poet like Marianne Moore, much admired for her detailed and revelatory animal poems, often worked from published photographs in books and journals, in addition to her own in-person observations. But the persistence of discourse about poems emerging from an attentive and embodied practice has something in common with Les Murray's whole speak. It describes, or aspires to, learning of the fullest kind. And this learning isn't just accessible to those who attempt to make poems. It's there for readers too. In a recent essay drawing on his Gifford lectures, the poet and critic Kevin Hart maps out as a reader what he calls the hermeneutics of contemplation, drawing on his own practice of contemplative prayer to open up poems, all sorts of poems, including by Marianne Moore, by the way, in new ways, not turning them into disguised religious poems, but uncovering a partial or fresh manner of contemplating oneself or the world. For readers and writers alike, exploring the metaphysical remains one of poetry's hardest challenges and one of its greatest gifts. I've always loved Iris Murdoch's line from The Sea. If even a dog's tooth is truly worshipped, it glows with light. A recent essay in the Financial Times by the writer Janan Ganesh was headlined, "Stop Talking About AI." His argument is that the cultural discourse about the future of AI is largely weak, speculative, and little more than a display of our own dispositions. Tech pessimists will tend towards apocalyptic views, tech optimists will tend towards utopian views, and he predicts that whatever happens, both sides will claim to have been right all along. I don't think I'm in either camp. As a poet, I don't see AI as a threat or rival to poetry or poets, but it does sharpen discussions about how poets and poems learn and grow. I'm not going to say much more about AI here, but it is part of the backdrop of any contemporary discussion of the humanities, of education, and therefore of poetry. My own thinking as a poet has been informed by some of the ideas on embodied cognition in philosophy and theology, and it feels timely to be reminded that I have more in common with my dog or with the blackbird in the tree outside my window than with ChatGPT, especially as we stand on the verge of ecological collapse. Poetry can speak truth to power, as the fruits of humanist learning can and must. But since poems at their best tell all the truth but tell it slant, as Emily Dickinson put it, there's no guarantee that power will take any notice. But insofar as it aspires to a form of whole speak, an ethical, truth-seeking art form through which we can recognize and humanize each other and see the world for what it is, then it does offer a glimpse of what 21st century humanist learning could be. And now I'll hand over to Andrew for the Q&A session.
Thank you very much. We have 20 minutes, maybe a little bit more, for questions. There'll be 2 roving microphones, so please wait until a microphone is in front of you before speaking, and it's relatively dark on that side of the auditorium, so please put your hand in the air quite high so that I can see it. Yes, I think there's somebody here with a scarf on. Christchurch scarf.
I wasn't clear what you were proposing for the future. For example, in schools, should they spend more time on theology, Latin and Greek, or should they spend more time on physics and chemistry, or is it about right at the moment? What are you proposing?
What I'm proposing, and I'm not holding my breath, is that it would probably help for us to think about school education, secondary school education particularly, from the ground up again. I'm not thinking that the solution is more of X, but I do have a question about the entire set of assumptions that governs secondary education. Why is it that in primary school, on the whole, children's awareness of their environment, their sensitivity, their imagination is taken seriously, and at the age of 11, it is put on ice for the next decade or more? How does secondary education somehow incorporate something of the physicality of primary school education, something of the awareness of the environment? How does it deal with a real commitment to growing the literacy of students about each other and about their own growth and intelligence? And all of that, I think, means physics and chemistry, by all means. Languages, too. Thank you, Andrew, for that. Very important. But in the context of a much more, and I'll use the word, humanistic understanding of what the purpose of education is. I said I wasn't holding my breath, and I don't think they're going to make me Minister of Education anytime soon.
Shame.
But that's what I'd like. Somebody over there, I think.
Thank you. Matthew Barbarao from the William Temple Foundation. Excuse me. That was a fascinating lecture and series of papers. Thank you very much. My question to Rowan, if I may. I had to write it down because I'm feeling a bit nervous. We've heard radical a number of times this evening. The term radical is often used in the public square as either for the left or for the right. But the tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk highlights how different people can treat others when they disagree. Now, you mentioned the disagreement between Calvin, Paul, Machiavelli. Charlie's role was to open up frontiers for debate and intellectual inquiry. He did this on college campuses. People might disagree with him, but he did it effectively, and millions engaged with him. So your call to engage in a project that is about investing in something that is radical, humanistic, radically unfinished, is the way you put it. How might we explore your vision, which the way you put it was compelling, within ordinary spaces? A radically ordinary way, a way that shifts the paradigm, as Andrew put it, in a way that helps us to learn and share as traditional and organic intellectuals, whilst finding hope in response to the physical and cultural devastation on college campuses.
Goodness. Thank you. Well, to quote John Cleese in 40 Towers, there's enough material for a whole conference there. But very, very briefly, I think if I hear you rightly, you're saying this is not just about universities, or rather, it's about universities because it's about a wider set of questions about how we become a more dialectically alive society, what I've in the past liked to call an argumentative democracy, where argument is not battle. One of the good phrases I took from Steven Pinker's book was actually, if we thought of argument more as a dance and less as a war, we might get a bit further. Now, how do we do that? I would say that part of the challenge there is how we support and extend the possibilities at grassroots level of deliberative activity, how we encourage more people to volunteer in practices that involve sharing this kind of debate about value, about purpose, and so forth. And I've sometimes in the past referred to a good school governing body, a credit union, a local society of some kind, in theory a political party, though in practice I'm not so sure. But those levels at which people have to argue intelligently for a common purpose. And, well, a bit of anecdote, if I may. I had the job for a couple of years of being the co-chair of the Welsh Government's Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales. No pressure. But one of the things we decided from the word go was that we wanted, in the work of the Commission, to model something, not just to come up with conclusions. And the modeling involved us in organizing a whole series of grassroots seminar engagement events around Wales, in order to give people an opportunity of saying directly what was working and what wasn't for them. That also involved us in listening to quite a number of teenagers from secondary schools, and discovering how hungry many of them were for this kind of conversation. So that when we finally produced our report on the constitutional future of Wales, yes, we made some recommendations to the Westminster government about further devolved powers for the Senedd, but more importantly, we recommended to the Senedd a heavy investment in creating more in the way of citizens' juries, in looking at how secondary schooling might pick up some of the themes we were working at. And I think that's one of the directions I'd like to push this humanism at that level, if that makes some kind of sense. I don't know if I want to come in on that. Not just me.
I think we'll try and get through some questions. So yes, there at the back.
Just to say, I found the three contributions this evening, extremely interesting. I'm a humanist. I'm not a Christian humanist. However, I support your endeavours because the discussion and the debate is vital in this world today. Okay. You ask what we might do to improve secondary education. So I might like to suggest a two-word answer for that. Critical thinking. I'm not sure that we teach young people in our secondary schools critical thought. We're only 50 yards away from a terrible event some years ago. You know what I'm talking about. And today is 9/11. And otherwise intelligent, well-educated young men flew aeroplanes into buildings. And I rather suspect that most people in this room would just go, what an awful thing to do. It's so obvious. So for me, critical thinking must be based upon evidence. And I think where I would kind of have a discussion with you is the use of the word faith. It sometimes it's taken so strongly, so literally, that faith overrides critical thinking. Cheers, thanks very much.
Thank you. I'm very glad indeed that we have somebody here who isn't a Christian humanist to remind us of the nature of the conversation we're in today. Lots I could say in response, but very briefly, because you've homed in on this one. Critical thinking, I am all for that as part of a proper curriculum. I had the joy for a few years of being the external examiner for a course in the University of Winchester. It's called Modern Liberal Arts, but it was essentially about critical thinking, about the foundations of philosophy, but not using just philosophical, but also literary and imaginative work, for one of what I thought was one of the most exciting university courses I have ever encountered. Needless to say, the university has now closed it down. But that was, to me, an example of critical thinking, not simply in a narrowly rationalist way, but not an anti-rationalist one either. And I guess that the discussion which you say we ought to have would be about whether faith is necessarily the silencing of critical reason, or whether it's in fact an enhancement of it. Because given what we all agreed was the radically unfinished nature of our human enterprise, well, faith is an act of trust in the capacity to make sense. And the resources of that making sense are not just the exercise of reason, I would say, but are not hostile to it. Which is why I'm so interested in Cardinal Newman, who in his Grammar of Assent in 1870 does this amazing job of saying, how do we actually reach conclusions? Scientific, personal, theoretical, practical, and maps out this huge territory, the different ways in which we actually make sense. We don't have to have a civil war about it. So I think that's where the conversation might open out.
I don't want to talk glibly about what we can do to prevent people committing atrocities, but I think you're right to say that alongside critical thinking, we also need exposure to creative thinking, because I think it's quite difficult to train someone critically and then they take a different ethical point of view. But if you've read the poetry, if you've seen the art of a tradition that's not yours, I think it makes it more difficult to treat them as if they weren't human. So exposure to one another's great products of human creativity, I think, helps us to recognize one another as human.
I think recognition is a key point here. And I remember somebody saying, I can't remember exactly the wording, it's quite difficult really to hate somebody you've sung in a choir with for a long time.
Yes, yes.
People do try it. And,
Yes.
they tell me that those who have experience in cathedrals, it's not entirely unknown.
Yeah.
But I think you see what that's about, the common exposure to some creative practice, not just of the objects of another, but also the practice, does make it harder to retreat to the corners of the room.
Thank you very much for that provocation to thought. I think there at the back was the first, next hand.
Thank you. I'd love to pick up on the point about choirs. We're radically reimagining what education could be. If the purpose of education is about building and ordering communities, and it is an enterprise that is largely individually selected, individually measured, individually imagined, we do this with a person. Do we also need to reimagine how individualistic our education system is? A choir is by definition individuals, but working as a group, doing something together, measured what they do as a group. What are your thoughts on a system that has become so regimented and regularly attuned to just individual admission, achievement, and measurement in this vision?
Well, you won't be surprised to hear me say that I think that that's very much on target in terms of how our system works. And once again, I note a bit of a shift between primary and secondary education often, between my daughter's a primary school teacher, so I get a little bit of the inside information on this. Context in which a great deal of shared enterprise is more or less taken for granted, to something which is more siloed and more isolating in some ways. So I think there's something to be said there, which is both about the actual curricular structure of education and, very importantly, about what a school encourages and makes possible. This is a memory I've shared before, and it's still quite a powerful one for me. When my secondary school in Swansea, back in the Middle Ages, we were putting on a school play. And one of my most vivid memories from that is of a couple of members of my class who were, like myself, involved in the play, who in class presented as semi-detached, indifferent to education, not very bright, and not the sort of people I would expect to be spending time with on the bus home. And realizing that these were people who had gifts I hadn't dreamt of in terms of technical skill and the enthusiasm that went with technical skill, and a willingness to collaborate with those of us who were getting all the glory from front of stage. And I've never forgotten that sense of a collaborative enterprise across boundaries suddenly coming alive, and a new appreciation of the fact that skills were different, human skills were different, and their difference could work so constructively and positively. If you never have the opportunity of a school play or something like that, even in the sports world, there will be people bringing different skills and priorities to the field, if not the table. And again, you learn that there are different excellences, there are different capacities, different needs. So can an education institution work hard, work seriously at making sure there is that diversity of opportunity for people to collaborate, to find out those goods that can only be realized together? So curriculum plus.
I think my sense of it is that, as has already been said, something usually is lost around the age of 11 when you go to senior school. There's a sense in which creativity being at the heart of education, and a communal creativity being at the heart of that, is lost. You can still get involved in those activities, but there's, just noticing my own sons going through this process, there's a sort of wild creative flowering, and a lot of that in music groups or in drama groups and so on, that kind of comes to a pretty rapid halt at secondary level. And that's not to say that there aren't fantastic and inspirational drama teachers and music teachers and art teachers and poetry teachers in secondary schools, because there are all over the place, very committed ones. But there is something complex also about the creative impulse. So for a lot of poets, and I know this was the case with me as well, and I've spoken to other writers who found this, somehow the shutting off of those possibilities being part of your sort of public life as a child in primary, the cut-off in secondary school, makes them countercultural, and you suddenly get a new energy to do them. So there is something complex going on there in the sort of... I think most people who are involved in a creative practice feel that pull between the desperate need for community and a sense of communication and a sense of shared productivity and creativity, but also something deeply withdrawn and countercultural, and the need to think when you're sitting down doing it, this is quite an odd, and to use that word again, quite a radical thing to be doing here. And there's a thrill to that, which you then, I think, at some point, if you continue with it, you bring back into that sense of community because you want to test it out. So somehow, the best schools and the best teachers of these creative disciplines are able to harness that and allow people to still feel there's something rather private and countercultural at the heart of it that you then bring into public spaces, shared spaces.
I'll add one quick note, which is that maybe things go underground or get put on ice 11, but if you go through to a PhD in science, then suddenly at 22, it all becomes communal again. And you wouldn't think of publishing a paper that only had one name on it.
Sure.
Publish 8 or sometimes 80,
Yeah.
because it took 80 people to do this work. And I'm struck that we don't do that in the humanities, and we could. 80 might be a stretch, but I'd love to see more 2 and 3 author publications, and that would set something of an example.
Yes.
Let me just take a few more hands. Yes. So I think you put your hand up first.
I've just retired, and every morning I get out of bed and read the websites of the newspapers and depress myself thoroughly. And the overall view of the world seems to be that we're descending into a world of raw power. Has raw power and the kind of humanity we've been so happily exploring this evening, have they always coexisted? Or is the humanism that we're all celebrating tonight in danger of being snuffed out?
Thank you. It's always in danger, I think. And I wouldn't want to be giving a rosy picture of the past here. I think here of the sort of iconic moment in the 6th century when the greatest philosopher of the age, Boethius, is executed on the orders of Theodoric, the king of the Ostrogoths. And we haven't actually started strangling philosophers yet, so I think we have some way to go. But it's always under threat. Meaning is always got to be advocated for. It's always got to be presented with enthusiasm. I resist saying fought for, because that just takes us back into the round of violent exchange, but it certainly needs to be intentionally promoted. And that's why, the visible symbols of that legacy, the Christ churches and other places, do matter. And when I say the Christ churches, I mean equally the University of South Wales in Pontypridd, and the apprenticeship college I remember visiting in South Wales many years ago, and so on. But that sense of humane engagement, because raw power, since it tends to get results by being raw power, has an awful lot going for it. It's in the proverbial gunfight, it has the guns and we only have the knives or the pens. So advocacy, encouragement, nurture, support, all the way along. But given the sort of beings that human beings are, I don't think this is all just going to disappear. Boethius may have died, but we're still reading Boethius. And not all that many people are reading Theodoric the Ostrogoth.
We have time for one more question. Is there anyone who hasn't asked a question so far? Yes.
Thank you. Been very fascinating evening, so thank you all very much. I was particularly interested in what you've been saying about secondary education, because as someone, along with my wife here, is involved in it, and indeed in this very building that you're sitting in, I wondered, from the university point of view, and indeed from other destinations that children of secondary age will go on to, about the responsibilities on them to try to help with the general awareness that not everything needs to be outcomes based when children are in secondary education, as I think is a perception amongst many of them, and most certainly we see it in this building here. And there's a perception, rightly or wrongly, amongst many of them, that it's all about the, what it says on that bit of paper or on that online message that they get in August. And I think that contributes to something that you've described about the sort of narrowness of aims and the cutting off of some of the more sort of creative facets which they have when they're younger, and often, hopefully, we discover when they're older. But what are the responsibilities on, top universities like Oxford, as well as other destinations more widely, to help sort of filter that message downwards?
Yes, and that's another excellent question, because it affects, doesn't it, how higher education institutions and colleges particularly think about their outreach. What's the message we're giving in our outreach? Is it come to us and you'll get a good job? Or is it come to us and you just might have a more satisfying life? Come to us and you will have an experience of intelligent community, challenging community, that will stand you in good stead wherever you are. And okay, it's nice to have a salary, but knowing how to live with a salary, which is possibly just as important or rather more so, but that's one of the things we'll help you with too. So what are we doing in our outreach? And indeed, what are teachers in sixth forms doing to invite that kind of discussion? But I'm thinking of the occasions when, as head of a Cambridge college, I was involved in outreach with schools and found the most satisfying conversations I had were along these lines, saying, we exist not just to get you a job. We exist so that a humane vision can take root. And I think there's probably more we could do like that. And if you're giving permission to people who may, like some of the youngsters we encountered in the work of our commission in Wales, who may actually be really hungry for that permission to think like that and ask like that.
It falls to me on your behalf to thank Rowan and Andrew and Michael for a fascinating discussion, and thank you so much for coming and listening so attentively and for your interesting and challenging questions. We've thought this evening about what it means to be human and what place learning and study has in that shaping of young and growing humans. We've thought about the place of learning, why it matters, how we can make learning radical in different contexts, especially in mundane and very ordinary ones, how we can make learning critical and also creative. Everyone's talked about language. We've thought about the relationships between rhythm and music and language. We've thought about style. I will beat Rowan up privately about medievalists who didn't care about style. He knows exactly of whom I am speaking, who wrote a treatise on how to do it. And we've thought a lot about education as a preparation for life, for full human living, but also for a life of service or leadership, for lives that effect change or confront challenges of ever more difficult worlds. Since I became dean, I do much less teaching than once I did, but the one part of my teaching that I've rather jealously held on to is that I still teach my doctoral students. And I've had 3 students, I have now a 4th, finishing their doctoral theses this year, and I say something to them that the poets may now rather quibble about, but doctoral students find it very hard to part with their theses. They are perfectionists, and they always think that if you just have a bit more time, it could be that much better. And I am wont to say to them, and I apologize in advance, a thesis is like a poem. It is never completed. It is merely abandoned. You have reached the moment at which you need to abandon this piece of work. Let your ideas go out into the public. Make them accessible. Open them to be challenged as well as received and welcomed, to be corrected, and thereby you yourself will grow in your own knowledge and your own self-understanding. For 500 years, Cardinal College and then Christ Church have been teaching men and latterly women to have the courage to let go of their ideas, to take their knowledge and their learning in and share them with a wider world in order that they might be received with acclamation or criticised or rejected or invited to be reconsidered. College and cathedral have done that together. College and cathedral have shaped and helped people to be human. We will do so for another 500 years and more to come. Thank you so much for coming.